Hello again, students. Professor Bell with you again. Here we're going to be talking about Chapter 9, Development Geography, Aspects of Economics, and Transforming Landscapes of Well-Being. So dig in and let's see what we get accomplished today. All right, first up, the stage of economic development and growth. There's a lot of aspects to consider here, and a good economics course will show you there's a lot more to it than I'm going to cover here. I'm more about the spatial aspects, though, and one of the things that the textbook points out at the very early going is the effort of Walt Rostow to discuss the idea of moving from an agrarian, if you will, a pre-technological society to one that is fully developed, say like the American economy today. And so the structure you see here is what he had kind of come up with, so that you would, see the step-by-step linear progression of economic growth. So, a traditional society, again, mostly agrarian, a few people in, for instance, local economic endeavors in industry, blacksmiths and leathersmiths and goldsmiths, silversmiths, you name it, all the kind of smithies and other uh, in other regards, people who would make, I don't know, saddles and weapons and you name it. And again, a few service people from educators, lawyers, doctors, saloon keepers, and things of that nature. But as you move your way along, preconditions for takeoff, you can see here commercial exploitation of agriculture, extractive industry, where you're starting to scale these things up and move more people in away from things like farming or being miners and lumberjacks and fishermen into industrial endeavors, moving into expanded factories to expand again production along assembly lines and the like. By the time you get to takeoff, it is a manufacturing sector. The British were the first to do this, and it spread very quickly to the mainland of the European continent. Say like the Dutch and the Germans and the Belgians and the French, and then across the Atlantic to the eastern seaboard of the United States and Canada. But eventually, you see, you move into the full drive to maturity and eventually, again, high mass consuming societies as we have now, consuming food, energy, resources all together, all the way around. The failure of this idea, though, is that it simply assumes that everybody would plug in, every country would plug in and take off at that same rate. And that's not actually what we see happening. We, of course, see that some countries jumped well ahead in the process. And so if you looked at the work of Immanuel Wallerstein here in the world systems theory, we see that um, it's just not going to happen that way for the peripheral and even maybe semi-peripheral countries. So these aren't the best maps, but they're the best ones I could find, and hopefully you can tell the top map on the top here is from 1800. So you only really had a couple of core countries, and that would be the British Isles, not Ireland, but Great Britain, UK, and France, with maybe some of the Low Countries, with the eastern part of the United States in 1800 and the Iberian Peninsula and parts of Central Europe as only really being part of the core, or the semi-periphery associated with that core. And then you have the periphery, which may be doing parts of that, but certainly not near the scale as what you'd see in the core. And then some external areas that aren't really ever going to be touched. And part of the lie of the map at the bottom that's dated from 2010 is that, places like the Sahara Desert or Siberia or the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau or the Andes or something like that, that's actually going to develop. So the map isn't really showing you the full expression of this. For instance, take Australia on that bottom map. It shows the entire country being part of the semi-periphery, but the fact is there's a couple of cities, Melbourne and Sydney, that are part of the top, the core, and we'll see this in chapter 10. But most of Australia has nobody in it. The outback is there's not a lot of people there. But if we did see, at least for North America, Canada, United States, Western and Northern Europe, part of Southern Europe, all part of the global core, but don't forget Japan. They're one of the biggest economies in the world too. But these semi-periphery countries are still really involved. If you were to look at the G7, for instance, the group of seven is U.S. and Canada with Japan, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Italy, and these are big economies. But then if you go further than that, look at the G20, you'd bring in powerhouses like China and Brazil. India's on board now, Australia, Argentina, and some others. Look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, on the map here. They're part of that semi-periphery because they're so vitally important with regards to petroleum. So that said, this world systems theory works a little bit better than the step-by-step linear progression that Rostow offered in the previous slide. Okay, so if we look at the era of the Cold War, first let me jump out and tell you that we tend to think of the third world as just developing or underdeveloped countries of the world, but this is not what they were known as back during the Cold War. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to 1991, and 91 it ends because the Soviet Union ends. We had a bipolar world, that is the U.S. and our NATO allies, and then we also had the Soviet Union and her Warsaw Pact allies. So those were the first and second worlds, respectively. And then you had the third world, which were honestly non-aligned countries. They didn't really want to fall into that sphere. And so understanding of the Cold War helps you to understand these kinds of relationships that were developed. So if I were to tell you, back to the chapter on race and ethnicity, if we looked at South Africa, for instance, with all our gold, diamonds, and other key natural resources, this is why we would be willing to overlook something like apartheid and the racial separation into that country. Soviet Union dies, though, and ends the Cold War in 1991. By 1994, we're less willing to deal with this country and its injustices to people who aren't white. And thus then, by 1994, you see the entire country shift and change to more democracy and away from apartheid. But anyway, this is a good explanation of how the world worked for a good, 45 years or so in that period of the 20th century. Okay. If you look at Willy Brandt from Germany, he was a unique fellow, but he kind of defined this. And when I was in school, there were actually a world regional geography course actually had two parts, and it had the developed world and the developing world. So it'd be one semester for one of the courses and another for the other. And so the rich North was the one that developed much more quickly and got on board with this type of globalization in the economy for the world. And yes, there were exceptions. You can see that New Zealand and Australia were thrown into that quote unquote rich north, even though they were clearly south of the equator. But they were connected to the world economy, obviously, and it just so happens too, of course, that they were loaded up with what were formerly British citizens and other people from what would have been those core rich nations in the north. So anyway, the poor South is still working on trying to develop, and that's because the keys of industry and connectivity and globalization are held by those powers that have already achieved that. So if we were to keep looking here further and see, if we look at gross domestic product, I've got a little box up here in the top that you can see that the United States economy with GDP, it's different from things like a gross national product, which would also include investments, transnational corporations, and the like. But if we're just looking at what we do domestically, we're head and shoulders above everyone else, though China is catching up. They have rapidly industrialized since 1980, and with 1.3 billion people and the motion of a communist central government directing things, they've been able to make leaps and bounds. Yes, it's a communist government, but realize they are doing straight up capitalism here. And so that's why they've been able to do so well. Japan, Germany, and United Kingdom round out the top five. But look at the growth of India here, one of these poor southern countries, poor countries of the South. They've broken through. Korea, a war-torn country at the end of 1953, because look, it's still in a state of war, just a ceasefire. They never declared peace and an end to the war. But if you look at North Korea going a wholly different route, and this is one of the great failed countries of the world. So you can, if you quickly get on board and adopt these things, yes, you can move those through those steps that Rostow identified as high mass consumption, but it takes a very unique situation and kind of a unified people to be able to do that. So you would see, a place like Nigeria with very large population and key resources. They're part of OPEC. They may, move up sort of quickly, but, you know, uh, there are always limitations here. And in some places, especially landlocked countries of Africa and Asia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan here, for instance, or Nepal and Bhutan, of Laos itself, some of these countries, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, as I'm pointing at here, very difficult for them to get going. There's problems with like Somalia here too, which has been in a war-torn state and a failed government for quite some time. So internal politics does matter. That you'd see though some countries like Indonesia really start to come on board because they do have a large population, like China. They're the fourth largest population in the world. So some of that is influenced by the amount of GDP that they can generate in any given year. Okay. Okay, looking at if we divide the the total production by the number of people in the country, look at what happens with China once you divide it by 1.3 billion people. India, basically the same. China's had better economic gains, averaging about 9% per year since, oh gosh, since the 1990s. But look at India; they were a totally bankrupt government in 1994. Then they opened up their economy and liberalized it, and now they've been growing about 5% every year, which is really good. But once you take every man, woman, and child and divide that into it, you'd see it doesn't look so good. Certainly, Canada, United States look great. The Nordic states here, Germany, the low countries here, Australia, New Zealand, yeah, they're going to look fine. Heck, there's only about 25 million people in all of Australia. There are cities bigger than that in the world. Japan has a large population, so notice that their economy takes a bit of a hit, as does South Korea's. But then look at a country, say, like the United Arab Emirates or Qatar here. It's this little peninsula that you see right there. Very small populations. They have oil wealth. And with UAE, they're developing properties and a different kind of economy there in real estate that's helped them. But you also have other countries here that just have very minimal economic development anyway, and then sort of the large populations that you'd see throughout all of Africa are really problematic. Again, the issue of being landlocked here for Bolivia and Paraguay in South America, not so good. It means it limits your ability to connect to the world economy, and thus then population takes a bite out of that development as well. Okay. All right. Income inequality we'd see here too. That we do have on the Gini coefficient this idea that in America that there are vast amounts of rich people here, billionaires upon billionaires, a Bill Gates or a Warren Buffett or a Jeff Bezos. But you know as well as I do, living in the South, that there are people in trailer parks and internal parts of cities and ghettos that really aren't part of this at all. And so that's an unfortunate aspect associated with us, that there is medium inequality. Whereas though with low inequality, you'd see governments that are more socialized that have this. Socialism has been made a bad word in the United States. But the fact is, we've been voting for a while to make sure that government doesn't work efficiently. We often elect people who don't want the government to work well, and thus it's not going to. But if we actually see in the states of Europe, which have very high levels of taxes but great government services, nobody goes to school for free or gets free health care. It's paid for, but by collectively the people within those states. So this is why their inequality is low. High inequality, though, in places throughout Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, China, obviously. They've got a population about the size of the United States that lives just like you and I do, a middle class society. And they have a 50 richest Chinese list, which includes plenty of billionaires. So they're going to have high inequality when you look at 8 to 900 million people there that are still living in a very destitute lifestyle, and I'm telling you they do. So you can have those, you can have a dominant government here. And build incredible wealth, but who is that wealth for? And the fact is, it's only for a few people. All right, I'm going to have to check out now, but I'll come back with you in just a moment with part 2. See you soon. Bye.